Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This is the final segment of The Straight Goods. I'm your host, Brian Lee Crowley. Our show today is all about education, schools, standards, accountability. And my guests, Charles Cirtwill and Alan Parry. Now, before the break, we talked quite a lot, not nearly enough, about testing. Anybody who talks about accountability in the schools, school performance, has to be talking at least in part about testing. But now testing is very controversial, at least with some people. You hear a lot of complaints about teachers so-called teaching to the test. In other words, being more concerned with, what test are the kids going to have to write rather than what does this kid right here in front of me need right now? How valid is testing as a measure of how kids are doing? Alan, I know that in Alberta and in Edmonton there's pretty comprehensive testing regime, so clearly people there have some faith in testing. Is that justified?
Oh, I think so. I think there's a general realization, because we've been at that stuff for quite a long time now, that there was a lot of testing going on before, by the way, back in the 70s. There was a lot of teacher reference testing. In other words, the teacher would set a test, and the kids would do it, and the teacher would give the kids feedback. But the problem with teacher reference testing, as opposed to standardized testing, is that you don't know what the result means. Like if a teacher gives a kid, an 80% mark in something, it's 80% of what? It's 80% of something that teacher knows about, but nobody else does, and you can't compare that 80% with 80% of the kid in the next classroom. So standardized testing, where all the kids are getting the same test, and you can compare directly across the board. If you think about it, this business of teacher reference testing, little kids went down to the local service station and wanted to get some gas in your tank. If each of the service stations had their own definition of how much constituted a litre, that's service reference definition of litre, right? Now, if one of those places gave you, you said, I want $10 for gas, and they gave you 25 litres according to their definition, and you went on the road to another place and they had $10 of gas was 15 litres, you get the same amount of gas, but they called it a different number. Where would you go and buy your gas next time? Now, kids know that at university, they go to the places where people give out the easiest marks and they avoid the hard subjects.
Some of them do.
Some of them do. But they cheat themselves when they come out of the far end. And what I worry about is kids getting cheated by only being exposed to kids by teacher reference tests. I remember a very sad day when a school trustee from a rural area came into my office one day and was in tears. And her child had just graduated from a elementary junior high in a rural area and gone to the high school. And this kid always had above average grades in reading. Went to the high school and the principal phoned her and said, well, we'll talk about your son because he's in grade 10 next year, but he's only reading at the grade 5 level. And she said, but he's only in above average. And he said, that's true, but what was the average like at that school your kid came from? And the average was about grade 3. She didn't know that. And he was doing grade 5, and she thought he was doing a great job at reading. The problem with teacher reference tests, where each school or each teacher decides what the so-called standard is you don't find out how dangerous that is until you hit the big pond, and then the kids are in trouble.
So, for instance, when kids go on, as you say, from small elementary schools to large high schools, or from high school on to university, if there isn't some yardstick that's been applied right across the schools to determine how you're doing against the standards set by the curriculum, you don't know what your local, your mark in your school represents.
The kid doesn't know, and the parent doesn't know, and the school doesn't know. So there's an advantage in knowing. And I think over the years, by saying in general about people's feelings about testing, there's much more acceptance in Alberta today than there was 30 years ago of the notion of standardized testing. It does have its place, and teacher reference testing does, but it's a different place.
Charles, you wanted to leap in on that business of standardized versus teacher-based tests?
I'm glad that Alan closed with the point about the balance here, because I don't think, again, we're talking about boogeymen here, but what happens, of course, with the testing argument, much like any other argument, is that people go to extremes. And the opponents of testing say, well, what are we going to do? Get rid of all teacher reference testing. We're going to get rid of all curriculum-based exercise. We're going to get rid of all these writing assignments, and all you're going to have is 100% standardized tests that you never see, that the teacher has no input in, and that's what we're going to. That's the brave new world that we're getting to. But I don't think any of the proponents that I've ever met or talked to about standardized testing would say that. What they say is standardized testing is an incredibly valuable tool to give you a concrete, measurable, and comparable assessment of performance, but it needs to be taken in appropriate context. It needs to be in association with teacher reference testing. It needs to be in association with proper curriculum development and testing of the application of the curriculum in the classroom. Are you in fact teaching in the classroom the things that we've asked you to teach? And that's another one of those things that a lot of people are uncomfortable measuring, but it's an important piece.
Well, in fact, it's always seemed to me that this about, tests are terrible because teachers teach the test. It's always seemed to me that aren't the teachers supposed to be teaching the curriculum? And if the curriculum is properly reflected in the test, teaching to the test is teaching the curriculum.
Absolutely.
I guess what people are frightened about is that the test is not very well designed and is not a good reflection of the curriculum.
And that's a fair concern to have.
Or more likely is that the test is a good reflection of the curriculum, but they didn't teach the curriculum because they didn't like to. And some people get in the bind and don't do that. So one thing that you can guarantee is if you have a good, well-designed test, there's the test of the curriculum, then more people are inclined to teach that curriculum, not something else that they want to do.
And there's a lot of work that's done on how to distinguish between a well-designed test and a poorly designed test.
Sure.
And of course, if the criticism is, well, we shouldn't be using poorly designed tests, I don't think anybody would want to argue that point. But if they're well designed, you're saying that they're a perfectly legitimate part of an assessment of what's going on in the school.
The other thing that too, I think that education has got to do some really serious work in, is to demonstrate to people, not simply because they say so, but because they actually see them doing it, that when they measure results, they're not going to beat people over the head with the results. And that's terribly important. I think that once people get the idea that we're measuring performance here, not so you can swing out of the trees and ambush the staff, but the prime reason for measuring performance and evaluation is to prove future performance, not beat people up the head. Then you can take away some of the fear. I've heard so many people, when confronted with this notion of measuring results, say, well, hold it a minute, but what are they going to do with the results? Because we don't trust them. We don't trust those people not to beat the heck out of us with the results. And you've got very careful to distinguish between, when you evaluate based upon looking at outcomes, to differentiate between the evaluation of the school on the one hand and the principal on the other. I mean, you've likely got schools in your recent report here where you've got 75 schools lined up in a row, and some poor school down here is number 49, and simply because that's below the middle mark, it shouldn't be assumed that the principal is doing a rotten job, because last year it may be 74, and he's taken it from 74, 49 in a year. Wow, the guy was doing hamstrings. So separating the valuation of the school from the valuation of the principal and the teachers in the school are very different things.
Right now, we've only got about 2 minutes before the end of the show. Charles, how do the Atlantic provinces stack up in terms of the adequacy of their teaching? If it's, as seems to be the feeling here, testing is okay, that it is a useful tool in determining how the schools are performing and whether kids are learning anything. We have a pretty uneven testing regime here, and we're going to have to really be fast about this if we want to get through the 3 maritime provinces. Just tell us quickly.
Well, the quickest answer is if you want a good testing regime, everybody should just recreate the level of testing in New Brunswick. 16 Francophone Center, because they test across all their core program deliverables, and they test on an annual basis. And that statement actually applies to New Brunswick, that they shouldn't be scaling back their testing regime. If they want,
they shouldn't give up what they've already achieved.
They shouldn't give up the high ground. They have it right now, and to fall back away from that is not a very good idea.
What about Nova Scotia?
Nova Scotia's got a long way to go in terms of actually reporting the results. They've got a good mix of tests now is having some problem implementing the math test, but implementation isn't the same thing as not testing at all.
So they're heading to more testing in Nova Scotia. What about PEI?
PEI is a lost cause. PEI's difficulty is that because of the small size, it's a cost measure for them to try and do standardized testing. But there are options that they have. They could oversample on some of the national or international tests, and the relative cost of that compared to the oversampling they do now for provincial results is probably cost effective for them, or at least it's cost effective if you compare it to the overall cost of implementing a standardized testing regime. And I think that if I was pushing for improved testing in PEI, that would be the angle I'd be taking.
Okay, well, we're going to have to stop it there. On behalf of all of us at The Straight Goods, thank you for watching. A special thanks, of course, to my two guests, Charles Cirtwill from the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies and Alan Parry, former Senior Administrator with the Edmonton Public Schools. It was a pleasure to have both of you here. Remember that our show is broadcast each week on Wednesday evenings and then rebroadcast on weekdays at 2 in the afternoon until the following Wednesday. We welcome your feedback. Our phone number and email address are shown periodically on the screen. We'd love to hear from you. See you next week on The Straight Goods. I'm Brian Lee Crowley. See you then.